In the last video, we spoke about the genesis of data, what place the analysis of data occupies in business intelligence and strategy, and what it means for practitioners. In this video, we are going to take a deeper look at the motivation behind some of the analytical practices that we are going to learn in this course. As a quick recap, remember that these four stages are the stages of the data cycle: generation, acquisition, analysis, and consumption. We had spoken about how everybody consumes analysis, but very inefficiently. Let's take a deeper look at why that happens and what we can do to fix it. To begin with, first and foremost, most analysts have a habit of simply reporting their analysis as plain, bare facts. We usually don't take the effort of weaving these facts together in a story like narrative. Now, why is this important? Because stories are what people remember. Facts, on the other hand, are bits of information that people are likely to forget. Of course, we are not suggesting that facts are not important, quite the opposite, in fact, but they have to be presented as stories. There is a very good reason why slogans, poems, and jumlas are more effective in, say, political rhetoric than plain bare facts. As an example, there is this website called significantobjects.com, on which Rob Walker and Joshua Glenn tried to sell a bunch of common objects. What they did differently was that they paid a few writers to write short stories about these objects. So, for example, this is an object called thigh hooks, and there is a fairly elaborate story written about that. And they found out that objects which had stories behind them were likely to be sold at a much higher rate than the ones that just had an item description. So if we were to quantify the impact of stories on these sales, note that in this particular quick case, they had a return of more than 3000%. In summary, stories are what people share and remember. But we as analysts have a very different problem. At the outset, let me acknowledge that data analysis is really hard. Not everybody can do it effectively. And because it is difficult, we tend to cling to every single piece of analysis we perform, even if some of it may not help the point we're trying to make, even if some of it is not what the audience asked for. Secondly, remember that your audience will almost never be able to replicate the nuances of data analysis. So, it is not your analysis that is likely to impress your audience, but the story that you weave around it. Now, analysis may be hard, but a lot of it is also a fairly mechanical process. What you do with one data set, you just have to sit down and do with another data set. What you do with a particular column or a given set of numbers, you just have to sit down and do the same with another set of numbers. You draw charts and then you replicate that chart for other data sets. That's what I mean when I say that analytics can become somewhat mechanical. There's always an element of repetition to it. And it is for this reason that many self service business intelligence tools are trying to automate the most routine parts of data analytics. Excel, Power BI, and Tableau are all self service business intelligence tools which only ask the user to click and point, drag and drop elements onto the dashboards which reflect your analytics. And since these tools are cheap, the rate at which companies build dashboards has grown exponentially. Building dashboards is easier and cheaper than ever before. And it's easy to make the dashboard look pretty, even if it doesn't convey anything meaningful. That's why it's very easy to lose track of how many dashboards we generate and what they do. This is a major problem that troubles a lot of companies that use self-service BI tools. But there are three major problems with most dashboards. It is usually not clear what question a dashboard answers. In fact, we don't even know if there is a question that the dashboard is attempting to answer. To figure it out, you have to look at each individual chart or graphic on the dashboard and interpret it. That is not easy. Secondly, the answer is not obvious from the dashboard. Very rarely do we find a dashboard that tells us exactly what we need to know. In fact, often the analyst who creates a dashboard has to painstakingly, at length, explain what the dashboard is trying to say. Interpreting a dashboard without talking to the analyst who created it is often very difficult. Actually, if there is one thing you take away from this course, let it be this. Do not be that person who creates complicated dashboards and then becomes a bottleneck when it comes to the interpretation of those dashboards. Let your work speak for itself. Finally, the biggest problem with dashboards is that they don't make it very clear as to what action you should take based on the inference you draw from the dashboard. That is often left as an exercise to the reader, which means that after spending a lot of time and money on analyzing data, the user still has to do their own data interpretation. In other words, dashboards tend to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. And what can be more prescriptive than stories? After all, every story has a moral, and that moral is what tells you what action the user should take. But this is not a new idea. We have been telling stories with data for a very long time. What you see here is called a Nightingale Rose chart. It is basically a circular bar chart, which was first created by Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. In addition to being a nurse, she was also a statistician. As you can see the title here, it's the diagram of the causes of mortality. She started collecting data on why and how soldiers died during the Crimean War. And if you look at the description, the pink area here represents the number of soldiers who died because of battlefield wounds. And the gray area outside represents soldiers who died because of infectious diseases. Infections that were contracted not in the war, but in the hospitals which were overflowing with wounded soldiers. And we can see that nowadays we are seeing a fairly similar trend with the COVID pandemic. We have hospitals overflowing with COVID patients, and that is why people who have non-COVID problems also are having a difficult time getting admitted. So, broadly, what happened is that Florence Nightingale demonstrated that more people were dying because of infections rather than because of their battlefield wounds. She took this chart to the Queen of England with a very clear message that you need to be spending more on hospitals than military supplies. And she walked out with funding. Imagine what would have happened if she had let the Queen interpret all this chart by herself.